from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. I'm Cohen Hegelke.
I'm Jared Smith.
I'm MJ Sassy.
I'm Maddie Snyder.
I'm Evan Hawkert, and this is our teacher, Ms. DePasquale.
All right, we are ready to go. The question for you today is, the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? And lastly, to what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? You may begin.
In 1815, John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was not part of the revolution. The revolution was in the minds of the people." During the founding period, from 1763 to 1800, the revolution consisted of principles such as popular sovereignty, consent of the governed, natural rights, the rule of law, and political equality. These principles were well understood previously in Britain, ancient Greece, and the Roman Republic, but were made revolutionary by American colonists writing them into higher law through constitutions.
Early state constitutions reflected these principles and embodied fear of centralized power. 7 state constitutions had prefatory declarations of rights, and all but one instituted bicameral legislatures. They also emphasized the power of the people by, as Gordon Wood wrote, creating equal electoral districts, requiring annual elections, and granting constituents the right to instruct their representatives. However, because most states limited suffrage and office holding to white male landowners, power only rested in a subset of the people, an issue we still face today. The national constitution, while still influenced by revolutionary principles, took a more balanced approach to instituting government.
The Constitution checked tyranny with frequent elections, restrictions on dual office holding, checks and balances, and separation of powers. While more reserved than state constitutions, the national constitution also emphasized popular sovereignty, evident in the House of Representatives election process, the Guarantee Clause, Article 5, the 10th Amendment, and the state ratifying conventions under Article 7. While theories of political obligation vary, the Declaration of Independence states that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thus, consent is necessary for constitutions to be legitimate. However, problems arise in determining whether consent must be unanimous, as was required by the Articles of Confederation, or if a majority of consent suffices, as it does under the federal Constitution.
After ratification, governments rely on tacit consent to derive legitimacy, an idea discussed by John Locke, who asserted that people consent to be governed by benefiting from a government. However, Locke also argued that people have a right to revolt, withdrawing their consent. Outside of revolution, though, the only way to revoke consent is to expatriate, which is rarely realistic. One of the framers' solutions was including an amendment process as a bloodless revolution. The amendment process under Article 5 requires a supermajority of states for ratification. The Constitution has only been amended 17 times since the addition of the Bill of Rights, demonstrating how difficult it is to acquire the consent necessary for ratification. However, since legitimacy stems from consent to a government, not specific amendments, consent is a less vital consideration during the amendment process.
Revolutionary principles remain central to American political thought, evident in modern-day equal rights movements such as Fair Fight and Black Lives Matter. The principle of natural rights is also prevalent today, seen in gun control and abortion debates, as well as the anti-vax and anti-mask movements. Although John Adams wrote, "The revolution was in the minds of the people" 206 years ago, his words hold true today. Revolutionary principles, while often controversial and difficult to achieve, are as important today as they were in the founding period. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
Okay, I'll begin. Nicely done. So through your essay, you referenced different times in our history and levels of consent. So what's your appraisal of the issue of consent today? Do you think it's it's more prevalent or less prevalent than it has been in different times over our history? Kind of what's your analysis of popular sovereignty and consent in today's United States?
I believe popular sovereignty is generally more present today, and we see through the addition of the amendment process that the founders included that different groups of people have been included and given suffrage, such as through the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments, which have helped improve consent that was not originally in the initial Constitution when many people did not have these voting rights.
However, we are seeing in certain circumstances that voting rights are being pulled back a little bit, or we are seeing voter suppression, such as the Georgia Senate Bill 202, which introduced new voter ID laws that can make it more difficult for Americans, particularly Americans of color, to vote. Because as the Brennan Center for Justice found, up to 25% of African-American citizens of voting age lack government-issued photo IDs, compared to only 8% of white people.
Thank you.
So let me look at that notion of consent. I'm going to sort of build off what you were just sort of alluding to there. So if we do see some trends in some states that might arguably be leading us towards voter suppression rather than expansion, what's the remedy constitutionally?
One remedy would be for Congress to exercise its power under Article 1, Section 4 to pass laws altering the election process. And one of the ways that we're seeing this today is through the For the People Act, which recently passed in the House and is currently awaiting approval in the Senate. And that would work in a lot of ways to expand voting, particularly working against partisan gerrymandering and enfranchising felons.
I think one way to increase consent constitutionally would be to pass an amendment requiring civic education in high schools, because a University of Pennsylvania study in 2020 found that only 51% of people surveyed could name all 3 branches of government. So I think that this shows that there's a real dearth of knowledge of the Constitution, and in order to increase consent, we should make it mandatory that the country and the citizens know about the Constitution.
In addition to my colleague's point, I also think another way to make people more willing to consent to government is a solution suggested by the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, created by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And it's to establish a national trust for civic infrastructure to fund these social, civic, and democratic infrastructures to allow communities to unite and actually discuss and deliberate on topics. And that would kind of serve as a safety valve to revolution.
One way to increase consent would be to make it easier to vote. I suggest making election days a national holiday, which was shown in Australian elections to dramatically increase voter turnout.
What happens if you're in a group, say in one of these states, and you feel like your civil rights have been violated? What's the Constitution offer you?
One of the things that the Constitution offers you would be the First Amendment right to protest. And so you have the ability to peacefully protest your civil liberties that you believe are being violated in a form of civil disobedience.
You also have the freedom of expression to express your political views and what you think should be done about what you do not agree with in society.
You could have some.
No, please. I'd rather hear from you than me.
You could have some remedies under the Fifth Amendment, which states that you can't be deprived of your life, liberty, or property, these civil liberties, without due process of law.
I want to take us in a slightly different direction, maybe more concrete. In the very beginning, when we were talking about the difference, when you were talking about the difference between sort of the articles and the Constitution, a unicameral legislature came up. Can you just unpack that a bit for me? How does, if we're talking about revolutionary ideas or consent to the people, what does a unicameral legislature represent as compared to a bicameral legislature?
So we can see, go ahead, Maddie.
One example of this would be in the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, that included a unicameral legislature. And how this worked was that there was this sort of open assembly of legislatures, and these were these enlightened statesmen. So discourse was more open because it was a unicameral rather than a bicameral legislature.
And one of the things that Gordon Wood writes in his book, The American Revolution, is that bicameral legislatures were largely used so that the lower house could act as more this representative of the people, whereas the upper house, or the Senate as we see it today, was viewed as these enlightened statesmen and less influenced by the people themselves.
And we see this further in how the House of Representatives and Senate were actually chosen in the Constitution, as the House of Representatives was chosen by the people, but the Senate was appointed by the state legislatures until 1913.
The Nebraska state constitution today still has a unicameral legislature, but I think in a federal sense, as we can see with how polarized politically our country is today, that a unicameral legislature would just lead to whenever a party got more than 50%, they would just take it and run and create just so many more laws than our kind of bicameral legislature filters out.
You argued in your prepared response about, you recognize the power, that so much power is held by a subset of society, both at the founding and then you alluded to today. Does that exist today, and is that a problem? And if it is a problem, what do we do about it?
One major divide I see today in the divide of power is between the rich and the poor. We saw with the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, that the role of money in politics nowadays is very outsized, as campaign contributions are protected under the First Amendment as an expression of free speech. And this has led to a great influence in corporate interest and of the upper class that has often left the interests of the lower classes unfulfilled.
And to Jared's point, a recent study done by the nonpartisan group Issue 1 found that 12 political mega donors are responsible for $1 of every $13 in federal elections since Citizens United. And so we can really see that these corporations have a disproportionate effect on these elections and a disproportionate then voice in these elections than ordinary citizens do.
Time.
Oh, there we go. All right. Good
I
job.
knew we didn't have much time left.
Yeah,
So.
it was close.
Nicely done.
Well done. Well done. Okay, I'll get going. It's our time to give you some feedback, as you know, the system. So very excellent job. Your prepared response was very thoughtful, very detailed. You clearly have done your work. We know how hard you work. It was very evident. Your ability to address a variety of issues that we threw at you in follow-ups very naturally, very, very genuinely. And that's very important to us. Your depth of knowledge, your use of evidence, some really interesting use of social science evidence, which I really appreciate. You're going beyond court cases and stuff and looking at some of these commissions and institutes. That's what we all need to be doing. I wish we had your constitutional amendment to require civic education in high schools. That would be the best thing like ever, but I don't hold out for much. What I would urge you to continue to think about is the structural solutions to some of our problems. In Georgia, there's some real, and other states, there's some real issues. They're couching their belief in we need to secure elections, and they're in the result, as you acknowledge, maybe disenfranchising some people. The supremacy clause in the 14th Amendment are also there, right? The structure and that 14th Amendment, which really refounded the country post-Civil War. So just something to think about as you move along and as you think as citizens. Stay aware. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, most impressive folks. And again, congratulations and commendations to each of you, as well as your teacher, for all of the hours and the aptitude you've developed for this. It's readily apparent. You participated very nicely. You played off of one another very effectively, and were able to support your evidence with critical thinking. As Mr. Fox just noted, I mean, your references kind of across the spectrum to, I think the last one on the donations of the top 12 people, I think just came out last week, or it was very recent anyway. So that was both timely and impressive that you were able to grab all of that. So very nicely done, and you folks will be on to good and big things, I know, here and down the road. So we wish you the best.
Yeah, the problem with going last with feedback is all the good stuff is taken, but I'll make do. I think you guys did an excellent job, as has been said, with the breadth of evidence that was brought in. The diversity of sources was very, very impressive. I also like seeing, and I would urge you, this is something I'd urge you to continue, not just sort of in this competition, but in your life, be comfortable in the gray areas. A few times somebody said, X is true, however, this portion of Y is also true. And the world, and especially ideas and civics, are messy and complicated, and diverse viewpoints. Some people are always partially right. That sort of thing is important, in my opinion. And I would just thank you very much for answering the question so clearly. So sometimes these things are prompts, and you sort of go off on a filibuster and just rattle off things but in your group, I felt that you were focused. Like you would bring up the evidence, but it was always focused on, like, there's 3 points to this question or whatever it was, and they were all answered very, very clearly. And I think that was one of the most effective parts of your presentation.
Good job.
Nicely done.
Okay, so awesome. I have